Good day, everyone. This is Evelyn Ackah from the Ask Canada Immigration Law Firm podcast. I'm so excited today to have our guest on. Our special guest today is Jeremy Bollington, and he is the president of Your Franchise is Waiting. And we connected on LinkedIn, and now I'm excited that he's joining us today to talk about his business and how he can work with entrepreneurs and business owners looking to move to the US with a franchise business entity. Welcome, Jeremy.
Thanks, Evelyn. It's great to actually see you kind of in person, I guess, through through Zoom. So happy to be here and look forward to a good conversation.
I'm looking forward to it too. I'm really interested by your background. So, as we were just talking before we started, you've got a really interesting background that led you into this. Could you tell us a little bit about where you come from, how you got into this franchise business consulting, and then we can get more into the nitty-gritty of how you can help our listeners and our clients?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I'm based out of Charleston, South Carolina, but as you can probably tell by my accent, not originally from here.
Really? You're not?
No, although I'm working on my y'alls and other kind of South Carolina accent pieces.
Mhm.
But no, so I grew up in the UK. Kind of went through school there and got into the banking world. Worked in London. Met my wife. We had a couple of very young kids, and the opportunity to work in New York for what was supposed to be 3 years back in 1997 came around, and we jumped at it. And I guess what 27 years later, we're still here.
Wow.
So I was in the banking world in New York. We lived in New Jersey,
Mhm.
raised our kids there, and got laid off in 2015. And it was sort of a tipping point in many ways because our youngest had just left to go to college, and I was sort of done with being on a plane 2, 3 times a week
Yeah.
and jet lagged and all of that. And long story short, we moved to Charleston, South Carolina, and looked for kind of business opportunities. Ended up kind of going through a franchise search, pretty much what I now help people do.
Mhm.
Invested in two different, of all things, beauty brands. One of which we still have, which is a waxing
Oh, cool.
business, so hair removal, and that runs kind of pretty much on its own. I've got good managers in place, and just keep an eye on it from afar now. Um,
Wow.
and
How
I
did
got
you get
into
into doing the your own enterprise, your own franchise into becoming the franchise support and consultant and how did that happen?
Yeah, it was so we were I guess we started the franchise business we opened locations in early 2017, kind of were building them up. One of those businesses, actually the one that we sold a while back, I was also helping them grow. So I was involved with franchise sales, recruitment of franchisees, and then helping those franchisees kind of find locations and coaching them through, sort of build out and opening and ongoing support. So I had sort of window into the franchise sales side, which is obviously completely different to being a franchisee and an owner. Um, and it sort of that area sort of intrigued me coming in I guess sort of by about 2000 late 2019. I was starting to think about like what else can I add to my business. Then
Mhm.
COVID hit.
Yeah.
And we salon businesses here were not closed anywhere near as long as Canada.
Mhm.
And actually, one of the second business I had was a blow dry bar business, which was headquartered out of Toronto. So we saw
Oh,
firsthand the
cool.
pain that those owners in Canada had when they were shut for a long period of
Long
time.
time.
But we were closed for 2, 3 months, and it sort of gave me that kick to, okay, let's think about what else to add to the business. And so I ended up partnering with an existing consultant that I'd gotten to know, who'd
Mhm.
brought me some good candidates, and partnered with her, and went through the training and everything else to start. And initially was focused on people that had done what I'd done, which was kind of coming out of corporate, looking for that
Mhm.
second act, if you will. Um, and then sort of stumbled, I think as we were talking about, I stumbled into the E-2 and sort of immigration world because I had, through a referral source, somebody introduced me to a guy in Germany, kind of worked with him. He's now been in the US through and is on an E-2 visa with his wife and kids
There's no
in
need to.
Dallas. Yeah, I mean, it was, found him a business. We went through kind of the whole, the full process, looking at the
Yeah,
investment amount and everything.
yeah,
And he's been in the US now over 2 years. I think he was telling me the
great.
other day that he issued something like 110 W-2s, so the employee tax forms at the end of last year.
Wow,
Is building a big business.
that's great.
And that got me sort of intrigued by, having come to the US, albeit under, different guys. I mean, I came
Mhm.
on a work visa. Then the bank asked me to stay. They sponsored green card.
Green
We got
card, yeah.
green cards. My wife and I now have citizenship. We finally sort of bit the bullet on that a couple of years ago. But
That's
it sort of got me interested in having, seen. I mean, I love the US. I think it's a phenomenal country,
great.
and I can see, every time I talk to somebody that's made that, decision that they want to come here, the finding the business is the one of the biggest challenging parts for them because,
Mhm.
you know, if particularly if they don't have business, formation experience, shall we
Experience.
say. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, so now I focus most of my efforts around, working with people that are looking to find that franchise to
The
support that
franchise.
E2.
That is so cool. Well, I mean, from an immigration perspective, we do get people calling or emailing and reaching out saying, I want to get to the States from all over the world, not just Canadians to the US. And they are looking for ways. And obviously, our job is to figure out what are the options. So you can work, you can have family sponsorship, and if you can go to school. And if there's nothing else, then obviously they always look at the E1, E2
Yeah.
options for them. And I guess my challenge right now with the E2 is the consular processing is very long. They are so backlogged, at least in Canada. Right now, it's taking something like 6 or 8 months at least to get an appointment and stuff like that. But let's say you find that ideal client, that is interested in E2, and we're able to say, talk to Jeremy. How do you help them? Especially, let's say they're coming from Canada and they may not have experience running a business. How do you help them in collaboration with immigration lawyers and all
Yep.
the tax?
Sure.
I'd love to see how that it's a team effort, it sounds like.
Yes, very much so. I mean, and I think if I think about, that sort of team, if you will, I think, obviously the immigration attorney piece is critical up front. I think,
Yeah.
and, if somebody comes to me, sort of directly and has not spoken with an attorney, that's really got to be the first conversation.
Mhm.
But I think, what I tend to sort of focus on and I think as we talked about, sort of before hitting record on the call, one of the things with franchises is they don't work for everybody because it is you're joining a system. There
Yeah.
are kind of, depending on, it varies by system, but there are
Mhm.
guardrails, and things that you've got to follow the system.
Mhm.
Um, and so for somebody that's, got that business ownership experience, maybe whether that's starting their own business or buying let's call it an independent business at some point in, let's say, in Canada.
Yeah.
um, they may feel frustrated by the franchise sort of structure, and so often, I see people like that are much better served to either, again, buy an existing business for sale or start, maybe it's a very similar business to where they have, experience in their home
Yeah.
their home
So the
country.
franchise, I mean, I know there are a lot of rules and, there's a whole package. That's why it's called a franchise. So you're saying that for some people, it's not necessarily the right fit because they need to be fully comfortable with all of the systems, right?
Yes, those guardrails, and again, it definitely. I don't want people to think that, it's rigid and you can't do anything without calling,
No.
the franchisor. But there are definitely guardrails, and the
Yeah.
and the the rigidity of those rails depend on, system to system. Some
Mhm.
are much more flexible, but I think where a franchise can be a great option, particularly thinking about E2 and that, somebody's moving to a new country. Yes,
Yeah.
maybe Canada and the US, not too dissimilar, but still,
Yeah.
some differences. And even, depending on which state somebody's moving to. But
Hmm.
if somebody's coming to a, new culture, new country, and they don't have that prior experience, but maybe they've had a, sort of a series of corporate roles, it can be a great option because it's, and again, we take people through a due diligence process, both upfront to try to identify the right types of businesses, the right franchises that can depend on the role of the
Hmm.
owner in a given business. And then they will go through a due diligence period with the franchises that we introduce them to.
Hmm.
Um, but having, if they've gone through that process and gotten comfortable with the franchise, it certainly should reduce, the risk. There is still,
For
I
sure.
always say to people, there's no guarantee of success, whether, and then this is not an E2 comment, it's a general comment.
Yeah.
People fail in franchises here in the States because they don't follow the system, um, or they just, they don't have the skill set to run a business.
Run a business, yeah. And you
And
find that a lot. I mean, when you become a leader or an owner, you've got to rise up and elevate your game because we don't all have that naturally. And so even if you've got an interest in owning, I think it's very much about they have to be willing to develop as well, to
yeah,
develop themselves into the leadership that their business needs, to be successful. What about like locations, Jeremy, like I'm sure depending on where people are looking, there's always a different market. Do you help in terms of that kind of analysis to figure out, if they're open to living, if I wanted to live in the States anywhere and I wanted a franchise, do you help with where they might want to start based on the market? Or is it more like they say they want to live in Texas and then they just find a place in Texas? How does that work?
yeah, yeah. I'd say so. Let's maybe we look at the two extremes there. One would be somebody coming and saying, and so often it's either Texas or Florida.
I know.
Those are,
I
particularly from
wonder
Canada
why.
with
They're leaving the
yeah,
great north.
the temperature definitely has a thing to do with it. But
Yeah.
so on one extreme, if somebody's saying, I want to be in, I don't know, let's use Dallas
Yeah.
as an example. Or on the other end of the spectrum, somebody's saying, I don't care where I go. It's much, much more important to find the right business and then figure out where. Um,
Mhm.
that latter approach is, I think, much, much better in terms of going, because the process at that stage that I will go through with somebody is, we won't even talk about geography. We'll
Yep.
focus entirely on, kind of the analysis and the work that we do, looking at, transferable skills, prior experience, investment budget,
Yes.
role of the owner. Is the owner going to be, a salesperson? Is the
Yep.
owner going to, assemble a team and it's more operational sort of focus and a whole series of other things that we'll look at. Um,
Hmm.
and then as we narrow down to, hopefully 4 or 5 businesses that fit those criteria and also are willing to work with E2, because not all and actually a lot of franchise companies are not, comfortable with, and we can come back to
Yeah.
that
Definitely want to
um,
hear that. Yeah.
point. But what I'll do then is really sort of, try to find the right business match. The person will go through, sort of due diligence with the franchisors.
Mhm.
And, if let's say they narrow it down to one business, they feel very comfortable with the franchisors. They've met and talked to a bunch of existing owners.
Mhm.
And then part of the discussion is like, what's the best, of the available markets that the franchisor has, um, what's the best available? And if they're
Yeah.
true, or maybe by then they've narrowed it down to say, okay, maybe like Texas, Florida,
Yeah.
South Carolina. Okay, what are the best, available territories? Because depending on the nature of the business, it's either going to be, if it's a bricks and mortar business, it'll
Mhm.
be sort of a relatively small area to look in to find the right premises. Or if it's a sort of a territory based business, it'll be a series of zip codes.
Yeah.
Um, so
And so you
that's
can only go into an area, obviously, after you've done all that analysis, it has to be available where in terms of the
yes.
franchisor's availability of, options.
Yeah. Now using the other end of that spectrum, somebody's like, I want to be in Dallas.
Yeah.
Um, the the process there, we're still going through that sort of matching process, but the challenge in that is I'm then looking at, okay, what is available in Dallas,
Yeah.
and that will, just by nature will knock out some brands that might have been a great fit for the individual,
Mhm.
but maybe don't have availability in Dallas, but do in other markets. And so it's it's definitely more restricting if somebody comes and says, that's the market I want to
Where
be
I
in.
want to
And
live. Yeah, yeah.
um,
I
yeah,
like that idea of just being open to all areas. I mean, at the end of the day, they want to be in the US, they want to have immigration status, they want to move to green card down the line. And so I think being flexible sounds like it's very important to kind of give them
yeah,
more options than less. What would you consider the average investment? Because I know franchises are so different based on all kinds of things, how they're valued, but what would you think would be the average investment that somebody who's considering this would need to have available before you would
yeah.
even really delve into it with them?
Yeah, I would say I tend to focus on, what's required for the E-2. And as you know,
Yeah.
it's a little gray in terms of,
Yes.
there isn't a hard dollar minimum. What I've tended to operate with is that the investment that the individual is going to show on their E-2 visa application, so what they've physically spent, before submitting the application,
Hmm.
needs to be 100,000, and I say with the caveat that I've had, a couple of clients where it's been slightly below that, and they got approval.
Hmm.
I'd say more real. I mean, it certainly gives more options if somebody is, you know, able to invest upfront. Let's say 125,
Yeah.
and as you go up
Or
beyond that,
more.
it it
Yeah, the
it,
value of
it,
the
it
franchise.
helps.
So for me, I usually say when, people come to us, for me, I work 150 because
Yeah,
I want them to be very clear. It's not just the low, and because there's variation, right?
yeah,
And I'm always looking at it's gray as you said, so it could be 75,000 for some people, it could
yeah,
be 200,000. And so I kind of always say like you need to really be ready and have that kind of availability of
yeah.
money to do it. Tell me
And certainly
about,
with,
yeah,
sorry,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to, can I just add to that? I
Yeah.
think two other things there. Some franchisors will really dig into that with clients and say, and actually I had this happen recently where somebody was they were having really good discussions with the franchisor, but we decided to sort of cease discussions
Yeah.
because we just didn't feel, and we being really the franchisor didn't feel the candidate had enough sort of backup beyond what he was going to invest initially.
Hmm.
And that often with franchising in the US, can be kind of hurt with the fact that somebody's coming to the US. If they
Yeah.
don't have a credit history here, they're
Yes.
having to fund everything with cash, and so that you need, maybe it's a business that requires two or three trucks,
Yeah.
sort of light trucks. The franchisor generally assumes and shows in their investment range that somebody is basically kind of going to lease the
Hmm.
vehicles. But if they've got to pay cash, that suddenly ups the investment amount. I
Environment.
think the other thing I was going to say on that something we look at very carefully is how is somebody going to support themselves here?
Hmm.
Because you got the business, um, which is going to suck up some cash, and probably you have to assume it's going to suck up more than you think, even beyond the
Yes.
visa application. But then, you're coming new country, maybe you don't have health,
Yes.
coverage. If you're, particularly if your spouse, if you're coming with a spouse, isn't necessarily going to be, taking advantage of that spousal visa straight
Yeah.
away and finding a
Yeah.
job with health coverage. So um, it's and I don't, sometimes people will ask like, well, what should I assume for that? And I'm like, I can't answer that.
No.
You need to do the research and be comfortable in terms of what your living expenses are
Yeah.
going to be, but sure as heck need to make sure you've got, funds set aside
I
for
think
that.
it's really important to me what you said about credit history. People don't think about that when they're moving. It's like you may have all the credit in the world and then you're starting over.
Yeah.
And that is, whether you're coming to Canada or the US, it's like you're starting over. I don't care if you're an executive or a student, it's like you're starting over. And so that makes it hard to get what you need financially through the banks, obviously, even a
Yeah.
credit card for the company. Like those are all things I think that are great reminders that you need that extra backup. And it's not like you're going to be making money right away, that the business is going to support you. So I would think like 6 months to a year of living expenses on top of it, plus the medical, like what you're saying, which is very expensive in the States, and if you want good coverage, you need to pay for it. So I feel like those are really good tips for people to consider as opposed to just I have enough for the business
Yeah.
franchise and nothing else. But tell me, Jeremy, about where in the stage would you normally advise a client to start the e-visa, the E-2, in terms of like, is it do you come to terms with the franchisor? Do you sign a note, an interest? Like what kind of stage? Because sometimes people come to me and I'm like, I don't know what stage you're at.
Mhm.
Are you ready for this? Don't sign anything until you know, like, so this is a piece of how do you get the E if you haven't committed something, but you also need to
Yeah.
get the E-2 before you can like start the business. So what's the timing there?
Yeah, so the way that we work, and we've had, successful approvals doing this, obviously, is that let me give one caveat. I Most of the businesses that I focus on are not business for E2s, are not businesses that need a physical bricks and mortar
Okay.
location. As in and by that I mean a storefront. Maybe
Yeah.
they might need, kind of a small office space,
Yeah.
or storage space or something like that.
Okay.
Um,
Interesting.
and the reason behind that is because, to answer your question about, how far along in the process does somebody have to get, if it's bricks and mortar, so let's say it's a salon
Yeah.
business, just for argument's sake. Um, the advice that I've received from, pretty much every attorney I've spoken to is that they can't submit the E-2 until, that salon space is almost ready to open. Ideally, it's
Mhm.
open, but at the very least, it needs to be there needs to be a lease in place, and, construction sort of built has to, at
Yeah.
least be underway. The challenge with that is that not only is the person paying, they're paying the franchise fee, they're becoming a franchisee in the system, they're going through training, they're negotiating the lease, but they're at that point they're on the hook for the lease, because the landlord is not going to do a contingent lease. They've spent money on the build out,
Hmm.
um, and so it's a and 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 then they've got to wait, in theory, to truly launch the business, because, it's going to be hard. Yes, they could come in on a tourist visa to check on the building, but that's, that gets a little difficult.
Hmm.
And so they've put all that investment in, and really with no contingency. And so that's, I think, why, bricks and mortar tend to be difficult.
Yeah. More
They also tend to be,
complicated. Yeah.
and just a much higher investment range as
Yes.
well, because a typical salon business is going to be 250, 300, 350, 400 to
Hmm.
open and to build. Um,
Hmm.
so what I tend to focus on more, particularly because I would say most people come with a more limited budget,
Hmm.
um, would be service related businesses. And to answer the question of, when do you apply for the E-2? So they would pay the franchise fee, which,
Yeah.
so they're buy into the system. Um, they would potentially acquire whatever equipment. I'm trying to think. Let's use a kind of a let's say a window cleaning
Yeah.
business, power washing business.
Yeah.
They would, if you look at what are the things that they have to acquire as part of the franchise setup there, aside from the franchise fee, they will typically pay marketing fees for usually through the franchisor to run, let's say, Google ads, Facebook ads, things like that to promote the business. It's possible to prepay some of that in most systems. So typically they'll prepay fees, so that counts towards the E-2 investment.
Okay.
They'll typically try to purchase a truck. That can be challenging in terms of, I'm coming from Europe. How do I get a truck?
Yeah.
Often the franchisor will work with them to help them on that. And then any equipment that's, large scale equipment, so that they're able to show, that they've made that investment.
That investment.
Some franchisors, not all, will agree to the franchise fee being kind of held in escrow, so that if they're not approved, they can potentially get some or maybe all of that
Yeah.
refunded. The challenge with that, and I often say to people, it's the franchisor isn't going to start their training program for you if that's in escrow, because they're opening the kimono at that point, giving you
Mhm.
their trade secrets and things.
Mhm.
And so I think in many cases it's better that they launch into that training, which they can often do while they're waiting for that visa interview. So the visa application typically with a franchise will go in once somebody has paid that franchise fee,
Okay.
acquired the initial sort of equipment, or at least paid for it.
Yeah.
And then hopefully they can start. A lot of the training is going to be online and remote, and then be ready to launch the business formally once they're approved.
Mhm.
And the benefit of that, I'd say, the last thing I'd say is that training piece. If somebody's gone through that, or at least started the training, when they get to that interview stage, if there are very specific questions about the business,
Yeah.
they should be in a much better position at that point with that knowledge base to,
Mhm.
to really talk about the business and how it's being launched and
Yeah.
marketed and things like
That's
that.
a good point. Yeah. It's just so interesting. I mean, because yeah, people come to me and I'm like, I don't understand. Obviously, I'm learning about the franchise business that you know about, but it's if they don't get the visa, I'm assuming they get nothing back. Is that how it works?
Well, I think depending on whether they had that escrow
Okay.
um, arrangement, or so if somebody is declined, what are their options at
Their
that point? I
options.
mean,
Yeah.
if they've bought equipment, maybe they've paid the vendor, but it's not been delivered.
Mhm.
You know, is there a way then to work with the franchisor to essentially kind of return that, or to sell it on to the next new franchisee that's
Mhm.
opening somewhere? Um, I think there are ways to recover that if they've gone through the training
Yeah.
and paid the franchise fee. They're probably not getting
That's
the
fine.
franchise fee back at
Yeah.
that point.
Oh, that's
Um,
so interesting. What are you seeing certain trends? Like it's interesting for me when you're talking, Jeremy, about the different types of businesses, because of course, when I think of a franchise, I'm thinking of fast food. I'm thinking of just the kind of places that we're used to thinking of as a franchise. And for me, it's usually fast food or restaurants
yeah.
but it's, or maybe service, a blowout place, a brow place, a wax place. But those are storefronts. What other kinds of businesses that you would say would not require storefronts besides like window cleaning? What other
Yeah.
kind of opportunities are out there? Because I can't really think of one.
No, it's a great question. It's also, I think one of the biggest things I, try to address and deal with, because I think most people's view of franchising, it was certainly mine when I
Yeah.
first got into the business, was that, the brands and the storefronts that you see. It's funny now, knowing, kind of the broader swathe of franchises. Now I'm driving around and you see kind of the vans for the HVAC
Yeah.
companies, or the kind of the plumbing companies, things like that. And
Okay.
you go, yep, they're all here in town with the franchise operations. So probably the best way is just talk about some of the E-2 approvals and
Mhm.
what businesses I've worked with people. So my guy in Dallas that I mentioned, he did an in-home senior care business, so hiring caregivers to go into homes to look after, generally elderly
Yeah.
or people
Or ill.
needing support in homes. A real kind of HR business, because you have you build over time a big staff of caregivers
Mhm.
in that business. But
Yeah, that's interesting
relatively,
because yeah, there is no need necessarily for a storefront and something like that. It's a
no,
lot of staffing, right? It's a
yeah,
staffing,
you'd have an office,
of course.
small office
Small
space
office, yeah.
for that. Let me think of others. So an irrigation business, so kind of a services business
Yeah.
providing like sprinkler
Yeah.
systems to both businesses and consumers.
Interesting.
Pretty low cost because it's limited equipment. Start out with a van, couple of employees, and then
Interesting.
build as the business builds.
Hmm.
Um, Things like window treatments, actually behind me, my plantation blinds, things like
Nice.
that,
Yeah.
shutters, kind of blinds, curtains. There are a couple of good franchises at relatively low cost there.
Mm.
You have to be, for that business, you've got to be more, kind of comfortable going into people's homes,
Yeah.
comfortable with sort of consultative sales,
Yeah.
type approach to things.
Okay.
Had somebody do a kind of an estate sale house clearance
Oh,
business. There are a couple of franchises in that.
yeah, yeah. Which is
Had
really
some,
valuable service, if you're dealing with that when somebody has passed on or moved out, it's a lot of work. That's really interesting.
It is, and definitely, one of those where you've got to be comfortable sort of networking in the community with that business because it's
Mhm.
building relationships with, kind of realtors, attorneys,
Yes.
just a broad swathe
For the
of
referral
people.
opportunities. What would you
Yeah.
say? Are there other countries, certain countries you're seeing a trend where you're seeing more people coming to you from in the last couple of years?
I'd say aside from Canada,
Yeah.
and I know we were talking about it before in terms of, motivation for warmer climate
Mhm.
and that. I'd say the other big one for me has been Germany and other parts of Europe, but mainly Germany.
Interesting.
That's one of the kind of largest number. It's certainly Germany in terms of Europe is I think last year there was something like 3,000, four
Oh,
thousand E2s approved for coming out
wow. For
of
Germany.
Germany.
Interesting.
And
Okay.
and similar themes, people maybe they've been to the US 2 or 3 times, just like
Mhm.
the culture and the climate
Yeah.
and feel a little frustrated at the moment in, from an economic perspective
Yeah.
in
Everybody's
Germany.
looking for that better opportunity. And obviously the
Yeah.
US being such a large market, it's people are really thinking about where they can go and land. Do you help Jeremy with people who already have franchises, like for instance, putting a new franchise potential client into an existing? Do you help with that too, or only if it's a brand new franchise
I would
arrangement?
say the vast majority of what I do is where it's new. Um, and I would say in a limited number of cases, franchisors might kind of market through the franchise broker, franchise consultant networks where there is a resale opportunity. And so I do, I do have access to those, but it's definitely nowhere near as broad as you would see from, let's say, sort of, business broker or biz buy sell.
Okay.
If somebody's looking for whether it's franchise or non-franchised business. Um,
Okay.
I think the challenge there I see is often and I think there are some markets where there are business brokers that will focus on helping buyers, almost like a buyer's agent in real estate,
Hmm.
navigate the landscape. And so Florida is one where there's sort of a co-broking structure in Florida that somebody can, act for the buyer and get paid a
Yeah.
commission. Um, in most states, that isn't the case. And so in most cases, business brokers are not really motivated to help somebody sort of like navigate that unless they see them as a absolute buyer for one of
Yeah.
their
That they're
businesses that they're
ready to
trying to
go.
sell.
Yeah,
And then you've always got to worry about, conflict of interest there.
for sure.
Um, so I do think that looking for a business to buy, and that's often where people will come to me because they've just gotten frustrated looking on
Yeah.
biz buy sell. They can't, half the things on there are not real, and they just keep going down rabbit holes trying to find a business.
Yeah, and they're looking for something they can trust. And I think the fact that you've
Yeah.
done this twice and you've also come from, a business background, but that you've done this, you know what the experience of being a franchisee looks like, and you've been successful in that. I think that helps because if it was me, I'd want somebody who'd done it
Yeah.
because you understand the inner workings. How do people reach you to work with you, Jeremy, or in terms of, how they can start that conversation with you with your franchises waiting?
Yep, I think I'd say two ways. If you're on LinkedIn, I think I'm the only Jeremy Bollington on on LinkedIn. So feel free to connect with me there and or message me. And then separately, our website, yourfranchiseswaiting.com. We've got a special sort of E2 section in that website. And
Perfect.
you'll also see links to my calendar, and you can go on and book a time for a consultation call there.
That's perfect. And so, just before we wrap up, are you seeing certain trends? Are you seeing certain things changing in terms of what people are looking to franchise into in the States that are, that's new for the next little while? I don't know. I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've definitely seen it in the. I mean, it's almost coming on 10 years now, that or
Wow.
8 years, 9 years that I've been involved in franchising in one form or another.
Yeah.
If I go back to sort of the pre-COVID time, I would say, fitness was probably the hottest
Mm.
category. And by that in particular, I mean sort of boutique fitness. So every, small sort of like sub-segment and niche, cycling, rowing, running, there was a whole series of things. I think that space has definitely, slowed
Yeah.
down. I worry that, to be honest, that there's too many, boutique formats that if we do actually eventually get that recession, that could be challenging.
Yeah.
I think what's grown strongest and obviously it's a very broad segment, but what really grew coming out of COVID was that home services type, um, kind of across a broad sway because people
Mm.
were spending more time at home and noticing that I really do need to get that room painted or things like that. And so
Yeah.
that's been a big growth area. And then I think the other trend has been sort of consolidation of franchise groups, be that through sort of private equity buying a
Mhm.
number of brands and kind of putting maybe it's a holding company that then acts as the franchisor across multiple different kind of segments, or just the growth of some large franchisors, particularly in the home services that have everything from cleaning, windows, lawn care, and those typically they're bringing that franchisor expertise to those subsegments.
Oh, okay. Well, I definitely feel like, the impact of COVID has been felt by everybody. And even as I said, the delays in getting your appointments for the E-2s, at least in
Mm,
Canada, are extensive because they're still cleaning up from COVID. But I feel like it's been interesting to look at what markets have arisen that may not have been so successful. Just like in any business, you've had to pivot and find ways
yep.
to do things differently. So I'm really excited to see what the next year or two unfolds because more and more people, I think, are looking to the US and are looking for business opportunities if they don't have other visa opportunities. And so I'm hoping your business just continues to grow and grow, Jeremy. I'd like to thank you so much for joining me on my podcast. And for anybody who's listening would love to learn more, we'll make sure we include Jeremy's information in our podcast, in the links as well to his LinkedIn and his website. And I'd like to thank you so much for joining my podcast. Thanks, Jeremy.
Evelyn, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
You're a great guest and really interesting background and business model. I'm very interested by that. So if anybody needs more information, you know where to find Jeremy. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.